I am excited to be able to talk to you about Jewish music, and it says I'm going to give a recital at the end. I'm going to sing throughout just so that you can hear different examples of Jewish music. So obviously, I'm Lexie Nuell. I'm 12 years into being music director for Temple Beth Or, and I love to talk about Jewish music because Jewish music is so unique. You can't talk about it as one style or genre. Even one language does not encompass Jewish music. Often I think people think it's just Hebrew, and that isn't true. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about the umbrella term of Jewish music, and it's exceptionally broad. One thing that comes up a lot is this idea of traditional music in Judaism, and I'm from Kansas City. I'll start with that. John said I went to University of Kansas, so I do have my allegiances there. But it doesn't just end with basketball. It also extends to barbecue. And I tell you that because when people come up to me and say things about, I like the song that you sang at services, but I really like the traditional one. It's as different as what I call barbecue and what you call barbecue. To me, traditional barbecue is molasses and beef, and that's not true in North Carolina. But traditional can mean almost anything, but what it really is defined as is where you're from and how you grew up and what your lineage is. So why is Jewish music so diverse? It's largely because for the last 2,000 years, the Jewish people are a wandering people. So we have been homed many places, we've traveled many places, and our music largely reflects the culture of the locations of where Jews have lived. So our musical examples date back way over 1,000 years. Rabbi Citron mentioned the Masoretes. These examples date back 14, 1600 years to between the 4th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. The Masoretes were a group of Jewish scribes and scholars that primarily were in medieval Palestine and Jerusalem specifically. And the Masoretes gave us our first examples of notation for Torah. And that's a big piece of Jewish music that has carried over a wide expanse of time that we still use now. They resemble music notes in some ways. You would not see them in the Torah. What makes Torah reading so difficult is not only do you have to memorize the vowels, you also, if you were going to chant from the Torah, would have to memorize those musical notations from the Masoretes, so from well over 1,000 years ago. So in brief, we can link most of Jewish music today to a couple of sources, and all of them deal with ancestral lineage. So there are 3 different veins of Jewish ancestral lineage where our music really comes from today. The first of which is called the Ashkenazic tradition. Have you heard that word before? So Ashkenazic Judaism, most of the Jewish people that you know, if you know some of them, are Ashkenazic. Ashkenazic means that they descend from Eastern Europe at some point in the last many hundreds of years. And we've talked about Poland, we've talked about Lithuania, Romania, Germany, Moldova. There are tons of examples there. It's the most recognizable if you were going to describe how Jewish music sounds. Often, when people who aren't Jewish come to our services, one of the comments I get about adjectives describing Jewish music is that it sounds sad, or that it sounds dirge-like, or that it's all minor key. Ashkenazic music, that's true. There is a distinct difference between Eastern listeners and Western listeners. So this music that comes to us from 200 and 300 years ago from areas of Eastern Europe, when they were going to write a piece of music that was to express happiness, a wedding, a baby naming, anything like that, our Western ears would hear that as sad. It was all written in minor key. That's come over the years into now. We still use a lot of it. We, as Jews, from the time that we're tiny, our ears are trained to hear that that's just a piece of our music, and we accept it as, it might sound sad to the outside, but we accept it as, that's a really happy song. One of them that you may be familiar with, Harry Belafonte sang a song called Hava Nagila. Yeah, so I'm going to share with you what that sounds like. We know that both from Harry Belafonte, but also just as people who, have you been to a Jewish wedding or a bar bat mitzvah before and you see the dance in the circle where they raise you in the chairs? It's the highlight of a lot of Jewish people's lives to be able to do that. If you just hear the song, it sounds like this. Hava Nagila, Hava Nagila. nagila hava, nagila venismecha. So you can hear that. It's a minor key. If you take away the words, which I'm not assuming that we have Hebrew speakers in here, but just the tone of how that sounds without words. Yai lai, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai. If you weren't familiar with, these words literally mean come, let us be glad and rejoice. To a Western audience, that's probably not what your first thought was when I started singing those words. It continues like this. Havana, ranana, Havana, ranana, Havana, ranana, venismecha. Uru, achim, uvrachim, belev sameach, uvrachim, belev sameach, uvrachim, belev sameach, uvrachim, belev sameach. Nagila hava, nagila hava, nagila venismecha. So you can hear that we know and interpret that as a joyful song. You would sing it at a wedding. You would sing it when a child reads Torah for the first time. You would sing it at the birth of a child, depending on the circumstance. So our most joyful occasions, for the most part, still carry some of that Ashkenazic sound, that Eastern European sound. The second vein of those three that I mentioned is Sephardic Judaism. Sephardic Judaism is another wandering set. These are Jews who descend primarily from Spain and Turkey. You get a lot of that Mediterranean feel in there. So I didn't mention with Ashkenazic Judaism, Yiddish is a big part of that too. Yiddish is a combination of English and German. You hear a ton of the Yiddish language in the Eastern European music set. In Sephardic Judaism, that comes from Spain and Turkey, you hear a lot of Ladino, which is another Hebrew meld language between Spanish and Hebrew. Do we have any Spanish speakers? Or people that can count to 10 in Spanish? That's what matters for this one. So in Ladino, because of the influence of the region, there were many songs that were written in Ladino because it was the spoken language, both of the time and the region. A song that I want to share, and how music fits in with Sephardic Jews, it's largely a rhythmic change. So in that Ashkenazic style, it sounds much more, I mentioned dirge, that it sounds chanted, it's very few chords. The big difference in Sephardic Judaism is that the rhythms changed a lot to reflect when we think of Spanish music. The instrumentation changes. This is the first time that we're seeing guitar. It's the first time we're seeing sitar. And you also are seeing different percussion. So this actually would have been relevant a few weeks ago at Hanukkah. This song is called Ocho Candelicas, which, can you take a guess about what it means? 8 is in there, right? And it goes like this. If you have any Spanish, you'll recognize the chorus. It's counting in Ladino. It sounds very similar to Spanish. You'll hear that the numbers 5, 6, and 7 are a tiny bit different, but when we get to 8, it's ocho, just like you would think. It goes like this. Hanukkah linda está aquí, ocho candelas para mí. Hanukkah linda está aquí, ocho candelas para mí. Oh, una candelica, 2 candelicas, 3 candelicas, 4 candelicas, 5 candelicas, 6 candelicas, 7 candelicas, 8 candelas para mí. Muchas fiestas vou fazer, con alegría hay placer. Muchas fiestas vou fazer, con alegría hay placer. Oh, una candelita, 2 candelicas, 3 candelicas, 4 candelicas, 5 candelicas, 6 candelicas, 7 candelicas, 8 candelas para mí. So you can hear there's a big rhythmic difference between what we would hear from Ashkenazi Eastern Europe and now what we would consider more of an Orthodox Jewish style to this Sephardic Jewish style. Here in North Carolina, you don't run into a ton of Sephardic Jews of that lineage, much more common. I don't really know what the percentage in our own congregation would be, but I would guess well over 75 or 80% of our own congregation is of Ashkenazic descent. Usually a Sephardic Jew will tell you that they're of Sephardic descent because it's not as many people living in the United States who are of Sephardi or Mizrahi, which literally means east of that Iranian, Iraqi descent. And that last vein, so we have Ashkenazic, Eastern Europe, we have Sephardic, Spain and Turkey, and the last one, which here at Temple Beth Or, if you have ever been here for a Shabbat service, we do use some of those. Our style is largely contemporary Jewish music, and that really is a meld. That's when Jews migrated to America and took on a lot of the attributes of music that was happening in America when they got here. So early examples of American Jewish contemporary music sound an awful lot like what you would have heard in the church. You would hear a choir. There would be organ. Beth Or, if you look up here, you can see the wooden box still remains, but when this building was built in 1978, the organ was brought from the old temple. We don't use an organ anymore, which is just fine, because that one doesn't work anymore. The pipes are in the wall, so accessing them to fix them, especially for an instrument that you don't hear very often. But it was modeled around what you would have heard in the Protestant church at the time. This space up here was not a classroom in the beginning, it was the choir loft. So at high holidays, when I'm speaking about, I wasn't quite born when the temple was built here, but I have heard many times about the choir singing from up there, and at the time there wasn't a cantor or a music director, so a choir director would be up with them, and I've always thought that would have been so neat to hear, just because of the acoustics that are so unique to this space. But as music and Jews progressed throughout the decades in America, music did too. And what you hear now is that our contemporary Jewish music was largely influenced by American folk singers of the 60s and 70s. So Peter Yarrow, who was Peter, Paul, and Mary Peter Yarrow, Jewish guy, and a huge influence on modern Jewish music. There's a woman who's now of blessed memory, Debbie Friedman, who people consider the first of American Jewish folk musicians, and she really was a pioneer in changing what Jewish music sounded like. So we were accustomed to that Ashkenazic style, that dirge-like minor key, and we were also becoming very used to the inclusion and introduction of English in our Jewish music. Because it was largely modeled around the church, you would also hear many of our shared texts would be sung in English, which was brand new to when Jews were coming to America and learning to speak English and including English in their prayers. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what that sounds like. And there's a word in Hebrew, nigun, which is a song without words, without real words or meaningful words. So it's lie, 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 ya, 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 die, die, things like that. The reason that we have so many songs that are nigun or nigunim is so that it doesn't matter what language you speak. Like I was saying, that Jews come from so many different places that there's not one common, everybody speaks this language. Hebrew is certainly our unifying language, but not all of our congregants speak or read Hebrew. So we use a lot of these songs without words to act as a glue for us, that it doesn't matter what language you speak, we can all be unified through these melodies without real words. So one goes like this. It was written by Debbie Friedman, who I mentioned. It's the Hebrew that you'll hear is, if you want to look in our prayer book, it's on page 40. But it's our song of freedom, and it's included in every worship service.
Limon
that example that we're still respecting that Eastern European tradition of hearing that minor key, but it's incorporating some of the rhythms and modes of American folk music. So there's a marriage there. If you fast forward yourself to now, there are a ton of Jewish musicians who are millennials, a little bit older, a little bit younger, who are modeling modern Jewish music around pop music. So you hear that style reflected now. If you came to a service at Bethor, I try to be careful about how much pop music we use in a service, even though a lot of it the pendulum has swung back to using less English and more Hebrew in a service, and that's definitely reflected in music too. This example was written by a woman who I think is probably a little younger than me. It's a good example of, you'll hear a major key, you'll hear Hebrew, it's our prayer for peace, it's called Oseh Shalom, but you'll also hear in the middle that she's written an English section, so to be the most relevant to the most people. Oseh Shalom. Shalom, im Roma, huya aseh, shalom, huya aseh, shalom, huya aseh, shalom, Aleinu. Bring peace down, bring peace down. May the one who makes peace bring peace down, bring peace down. May the one who makes peace bring peace down, bring peace down. May the one who makes peace bring peace down. Oh, say shalom. Example, we hear the meld of Hebrew and English. We also hear it ending major, which is, if you're not musical, ending on a happy note, which I'm hoping I'm doing now, ending on a happy note for you. So we've traveled a long way from that more chanted sound in a minor key to what we hear now in the Americas. Half of living Jewry do live in the United States. So we are, like I started with, a wandering people, and that Jewish music will continue to wander and change over time, and that's what I find so fascinating about it, is that what it sounds like now will not be the same as what it sounds like toward the end of my career. And I think that that's a terrifically unique thing about Jewish music, that we are constantly evolving and constantly changing. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about Jewish music, or somebody asked before if congregational singing is a thing, and it certainly is at Bethor. We love to have, one of the things that I noticed first when I came here, I did an apprenticeship to learn how to do this job with a cantor in Kansas City, where I'm from, and she is from a different generation than me, but also a different style than I am. If you just heard her, she sounds, her training is an opera performance, and we're very different. So my training with her was more by the book. So there are certainly sections that traditionally only the cantor would sing and the congregation would respond only in this little section. When I came to Bethor, I learned very fast that Bethor sings everything without any break for this is the cantors and this is not. So we are a musical congregation. We love to sing. I love it when people learn new songs with us, and we try to keep a delicate balance. Bethor is an interesting place in that most of our congregants are not born and raised in Raleigh. A lot of our congregants are not from North Carolina. You have a ton of people who have moved here for a variety of reasons from the Northeast, from the Midwest, but because we are a melting pot in and of ourselves, I find that it's a pretty neat and successful thing to really mix up our music, to use some of the more traditional Ashkenazic style, to use some contemporary, to use some English, so that everyone who comes, whether or not you grew up Orthodox, we have members here who are not Jewish, who are married to a Jewish person, but to try to create a musical community where anyone can participate regardless of how you came to Beth Or, how you came to Judaism. But that's what Jewish music looks like at Beth Or. Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah, sure.
Debbie Freeman seems to be well represented in your collection.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Is she a current writer?
Debbie Freeman passed away in 2011, so she's not currently writing anymore. We do still use a large bulk of her collection of music. She started out in the late 60s. Her first album came out, and it was really shocking at the time. One, like Rabbi Citron mentioned, women at the time that she began writing were not able to be rabbis. In an Orthodox community, men are not permitted to hear women singing, so you would never hear or see a woman on our bima, on our altar, let alone using a singing voice. So for a young woman to be playing guitar and singing and to have recorded these Hebrew words, it was groundbreaking. So we do still use a ton of her music, even though at this point some of her music is over 50 years old, so it does sound a little bit dated, but out of respect to, she was the pioneer for American Jewish folk music. So we do use it a lot. You see it in our prayer book a ton. Lots of times kids don't know that there are other ways to sing prayers except for how Debbie Friedman wrote them. Mm-hmm. Sure.
I heard music that, to my ear, it was like, I've just never heard that before. Oh, yes, I have. I heard it in the Cecil B. DeMille movies.
There you go, yeah, sure. A lot of different influences, but now that's something that we pride ourselves on, that because we are a wandering people, it is a melting pot, and that's music is one way that that's reflected sort of across the board. Here at Beth Or, so primarily our music is me, and I play guitar. We do have a pianist who plays with us occasionally. The only time that you hear a choir at Beth Or, our movement has moved away from some choral singing, and the reason for that is because we want to include all people in, anybody that comes is able to participate in singing. Sometimes there's a perception that if there's a choir, you're supposed to listen to them and not join in their singing. So the only time I do use a choir is at our high holidays, at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and that's a much more formal feeling. Occasionally we do, yeah, especially when we're in once a quarter-ish, we have a large music service that meets in our congregational hall because it exceeds the size of this space. And we use drums and piano and banjo, and occasionally we have fiddle, we have 2 guitars. It just depends on musicians' availability, but we're open to using all of those. We also have a youth music program where kids on Sunday mornings come in and help me teach our younger students, and most of them play guitar, but occasionally you get a ukulele, or we're not picky, a kazoo, it doesn't matter. Yeah, but. Yeah, so cello is used for their Kol Nidre is it's the name of a service, it's also the name of a prayer. It's one of the most sacred moments of the year. Once the Kol Nidre prayer has begun, we don't let people come. You can't come in late. It's like going to the movies. If you come in late, you have to wait until that prayer has been recited. It's done 3 times on Yom Kippur. Here at Beth Or, there's somebody reads it in English. I sing it in Hebrew, and then the cello plays. And it's a long piece. It's 12 minutes long on the cello, but that's another example of instrumentation. In fact, before I came here, I thought it was only for cello. I had never heard it sung. I had only heard it read and played on cello. Mm-hmm.
The song you said that you use at every service, mm-hmm. At this congregation only?
So when I say we use it at every service, I mean the Hebrew text is used at every service primarily. That's our song of freedom, Mi Chamocha, and it literally means who is like you, God. There are, I shouldn't even hazard a guess, 50, 75, 100 different ways to sing it. It's very common for contemporary songwriters to use that text in new melodies, but the Hebrew text is what I mean, not just that melody. Here at Beth Dor, I use about 5 or 6 different melodies for Micha Mocha. That's true for most of the things we do. I try to keep things to about 5 or 6 different so that everybody can sing along. Mm-hmm.
Several decades ago, I sang with a choral group that did Leonard Bernstein's Chester Songs.
Mm.
And it was sung in Hebrew.
Oh, wow.
And it was a beautiful piece of music, but the only way I could learn it is that the vowels were the same as Latin vowels. Do you have people of his caliber writing that type of Jewish music anymore? And I'm not sure when it was written.
Sure. I would be giving you my opinion. I think that we have some really prolific songwriters right now in Jewish music. It depends on what genre of music you like. There are classical Jewish composers who are still working. Classical Jewish music does not have as much of a home in congregational life anymore, with the exception of our high holiday time, which is the most formal time of the year. The most successful songwriters who are working right now in Jewish music are writing that contemporary folk pop music.
It would be like for a concert setting.
Sure.
Imagine it's being a part of a worship setting.
It's definitely being written. It's not as common anymore. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you have a choir once a year?
We do.
Or is it congregants that just get together?
It's half and half. So it is, we're made up primarily, we do have congregants in each of the 4 vocal sections, and then I hold auditions and hire professional musicians who sing with us for filling out the rest of the sections. And some of those choir members who I say it's audition and they're professional musicians, some of them have been with us for 30 years, that they're essentially volunteering at this point. They just have become part of the fabric of our community, and yeah, it's always sad when somebody decides to retire from the choir, because some of them truly have been there my whole life. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about your education.
Sure.
Just kind of, I don't, explain, tell me what you majored in and
Sure.
where did you go?
Well, I'm different than if you talk to another person so I'm not a cantor. A cantor goes to seminary for 5 years beyond undergrad, largely the same program as the rabbis do, and that school for the Reform movement is based in New York. I went to University of Kansas to study politics, and really, I even took the LSAT. I really thought I would be an attorney, and then I got out a few years before the recession, and it just so happened that my temple was hiring a youth director. I was the worst youth director of all time. So it just happened that just as the person that runs the youth groups, I was the worst. I was just extremely fortunate that the cantor who worked at that synagogue was open to an apprenticeship. She knew that I could sing, and she knew that I played guitar. I sang all through my upbringing. My parents are both musicians, and I also sang in choir in college, but for fun. I had thought maybe I would major in musical theater. I was always involved in summer stock and things like that. When I got to this horrible job as a youth director, the cantor had approached me about, would you be interested in becoming a song leader? Would you be interested in using your guitar in the school? And it started like that and grew into, by the end of my time, I was able to do some of High Holidays with her, that I had learned to read and use Hebrew. I had learned to teach bar and bat mitzvah students who are approaching Torah for the first time. Without her, I would not have been able to even dream of applying for this job. I was really young when I came. Beth Dor took a big risk. I was 24 when I came and 25 when I started. So I sort of thought I would be here for 18 months or 2 years or whatever a 24-year-old thinks, and now it's 12 years later.